I'm in the process of installing this engine replacement wiring harness in my 1994 E320 Coupe. This is a very nice car. It only has 115,000 miles on it, and it's just pristine, well-maintained garage, but the wiring harness is failing. And if you've been around these old Mercedes for any length of time, you've probably heard about this wiring fiasco. You know, apparently Mercedes decided they wanted to go green with their wiring, and they developed what they felt was a biodegradable wiring harness insulation. And of course, the intent was great, but the problem was with age and heat, the insulation just turned brittle and would fall right off the wires. And the problem when this happens is you'll get all kinds of engine weird running situations, misfiring, hard starting, and sometimes you'll be driving down the road and the engine will just quit. So it is a safety issue. So if you have a 1992 to 1996 Mercedes-Benz, you need to determine, number one, if you have a model which has the faulty wiring harness. Number two, you need to determine whether or not it's ever been changed, and if not, you need to change it. Don't drive the car with a bad, failing wiring harness. Now, in this car, it didn't take me long to determine the wiring harness hadn't been replaced. There's a tag you can find up by the battery box that will give you the date and year of manufacture, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in this particular situation, I just look up towards the front of the engine. I'm going to show you this here in a second, but I can just look up here and check out a few wires, and right away I know that this wiring harness is bad. So the purpose of this video is to encourage you to not be afraid of having to replace one of these wiring harnesses. Some of these cars, particularly like this E320 Coupe, the last of the series of 94 and 95, they're great cars, except to have this wiring harness issue. Well, if you take it into the dealer, you're going to pay close to $2,000 to have the wiring harness changed. You know, a replacement wiring harness is maybe, $1,400 to $1,600 brand new. But this wiring harness right here, I purchased for $220 on eBay. And you'll find wiring harnesses from reputable sellers who've removed these from wrecked cars, from wrecking yards that know about the problem with these harnesses. They'll remove them. And they all have a date on them. In other words, don't buy one if you don't have this tag on it, which shows the date. This is a Delphi wiring harness. This was a company that made most of the replacements for Mercedes-Benz. And right on here, the manufacturing date is 03/02/04. So it was made in 2004. So this is a good wiring harness. And I'm looking at this, and it virtually looks brand new. A lot of times these wiring harnesses get replaced on these cars, and after that the cars don't get driven very much because they get older and older. So just because you have a really nice car or it's in pristine condition doesn't have anything to do with this wiring harness. Once again, it's the heat of the engine and the age of the insulation that cause it to crack and fall off. And when that happens, you know what happens. You've got wires shorting into each other. So I just want to take the camera now and show you how I quickly determined that this wiring harness had never been changed. The purpose of this video is not to show you how to replace the wiring harness or the wiring harnesses, because there's actually two of them. You have an upper harness and then a small harness that goes down below the engine, but I'm not going to get into all the details on that. There's lots of information on the internet about replacing these wiring harnesses. Something you can do yourself. You just have to be careful. I'm going to show you a few tips on how to do this, prevent losing track of what you need to plug in where. But basically, it's just to unplug, remove, and put the new one in and plug everything back in place. So let me show you now how I was able to determine, right after I purchased this car, that the wiring harness was original. Now on these M104 6-cylinder engines, it's very easy to do a quick wiring harness inspection. Just remove this front cover on the front of the engine, and you're going to be looking at some of the fasteners and plugs right here in this area. Look at this plug right here. If you look closely, look at that. I can already see copper wire. And just take a hold of the insulation and watch what happens. See how hard and brittle that is? And it'll break. And when you break away here, look, I'm seeing bare wires right there. So you can imagine what happens when this starts deteriorating inside the tape and inside the covers and starts shorting out against each other. Look at this ground wire over here. Look at that. I'm just sitting here picking away at that, and the insulation is just falling off the copper wire. So if you see this, if you see hard insulation and you see copper wires showing up when you start peeling back some of the insulation, you're going to have to replace the harness. Don't even hesitate. Go out and find a harness right away and get it changed. Now, if the harness has been replaced, you're going to see this. You're going to see very flexible insulation like this. See that? How flexible that is. You're going to look at the same plug, and you can pull the cover back, and you're going to look at the wire insulation and flex it. And look, there's no deterioration at all with the insulation on this replacement harness that I bought used. Now, I mentioned the years 1992 to 1996, but not all 1992 to 1996 models will have this wiring harness problem. You need to determine by your year and model whether or not you have a harness installed on the engine which is susceptible to deterioration. This is the number one clue right here. I'm going to show it to you. If you have an engine that has electronic fuel injectors, in other words, it has a plug that plugs into the fuel injectors, then you're going to have a wiring harness that might be a problem. You know, the wiring harnesses on the old CIS mechanical fuel injection cars are not a problem, generally speaking. So this model here has the later style electronic fuel injection. This first showed up in the 1992 model W140 V8s in the US market. And then in 1993, you know, it started showing up in the W124. And some of these will move right on into the year 1996. So you're going to have to look at the wiring harness closely to determine whether there's any deterioration on it. And the V12s are also susceptible to that, and those wiring harnesses are very, very expensive. So let me show you one other thing you can check, and that's the part number on the wiring harness. Not all wiring harnesses are identical for even the W124 model. So when you go to replace the wiring harness, you want to make sure you're getting the identical part number. Let me show you now where that part number is located. The part number for the wiring harness on the W124 chassis is located close to where it plugs into the computer, right here, tucked in behind the battery box tray. You'll have to remove the battery to get to it. You can see here that this is about ready to fall off, so don't be surprised if you don't find a tag. You're going to have to do some research on the internet to find out where your part number is located if you have some other model. But look at that. I'm looking at that right now. That says 124440563 and the manufacturing date is 1993. So this is an original wiring harness. When I go to buy a replacement, I want to make sure it matches that number right there. Now let me share with you a couple tips that you may find helpful when replacing your own wiring harness in your older Mercedes-Benz. Number one, don't just take the old harness and remove it. This often gets people in trouble because they'll come in here and they'll just start unplugging everything and they'll rip the whole old harness out. In some cases, they'll even cut it. And then they'll get the new harness and they'll go, uh-oh. This is the first thing that can happen, is you'll say, oh, it's not the same. So here's what I do. I usually start by unhooking any of the covers. I unplug the wires from the fuel injectors. I unplug the wires from the coils, and I kind of lift this out of the way. And then I'll take and I'll put the new one right next to it like this. And the first thing I'll do is I'll come in here and do a quick inspection to make sure all the plugs are the same. And once you determine all the plugs are the same, then you can start unplugging the old harness the rest of the way and plugging the new one in a systematic manner, starting with the front. So I'll put this close by here and I'll start running these wires around. I got some go down here and some go down in the front of the engine. And I'm going to start right now by just unplugging some of these wires and starting here and plugging the new ones in, working down there, and then I'll work my way back as I plug in to the coils and to the fuel injectors, and at that point I'm going to have to route it to the firewall and get it over to the computer. If you do it systematically like that, it'll be less frustrating and less confusing, and you're going to make sure you get the right harness. So I think you can see it's not a difficult job to replace the wiring harness yourself. I know I get questions all the time, well, Kent, should I just avoid buying those cars? I don't think so. And let me explain. I recently bought a 1995 S600 coupe with a V12. I wouldn't have even considered purchasing that car except the seller had receipts of over $3,000 having the dealer replace all the wiring harnesses on that V12 engine. So, that was a no-brainer. I didn't have to worry about that particular issue. I probably would not buy a V12 with a wiring harness problem, okay? But with a V6 like this, where the wiring harnesses are readily available on eBay, well, you might want to reconsider. Now, obviously, if you're going to have to pay $1,400 for a new one from some online supplier, you might think twice. But let me share one more aspect of this whole scenario is if you're knowledgeable about these wiring harness problems and you see a nice car that you want to go look at, take with you this knowledge and do a quick inspection of the harness. And if the harness is faulty, you can use that often as a negotiating lever with the seller to say, hey, look, I really like your car. It's a beautiful car. But are you aware it's got this wiring harness issue, and a new wiring harness is, $1,400 or more? And often the seller will go, wow, I wasn't aware of that. And if he does his own research, he'll find out he's got a real problem and he may have a car that's difficult to sell. So sometimes you can negotiate the price down on the car considerably and then go out and find a wiring harness like I did for $200 to $400 in the used market. Once again, don't be afraid to buy a used wiring harness. You saw how nice that wiring harness was that I just got a few weeks ago. So you just have to be careful. You have to look at the seller's reputation or the reputation of the wrecking yard. Of course, if you're going to a wrecking yard, you can visually inspect it yourself. But try to get one that has the newest possible year. Don't get one that maybe is a 1996 or a 1997 wiring harness. Try to get one up in the early 2000s like I got, and you'll find you get a really nice harness. There's no way that that harness is not going to perform as well as a brand new one for as long as I own the car. So in parting, do not be afraid to tackle these Mercedes with these wiring harness problems.